The guests froze. The music stopped mid-note. And there, in the center of the grand ballroom, stood the millionaire's daughter on her own 2 feet for the first time in her life. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, her legs uncertain, but her chin lifted high. The crystal chandeliers above cast golden light over her, making her seem almost ethereal. For a moment no one spoke. They could not. Then, like a wave, the sound of gasps swept across the room. But this is not where the story begins. We rewind. The sprawling Beaumont estate lay on the edge of the city, an ocean of manicured gardens, marble fountains and high-arched windows that seemed to look down on the world. Inside, priceless art lined the hallways, and every surface gleamed as though time itself dared not leave a mark. It was the home of Richard Beaumont, one of the most influential businessmen in the country. His fortune was vast, his connections endless, his presence commanding. Yet, behind the power and the polished smile, there was something softer, something guarded. Sophie. His only child. She was 10 years old, with a face like sunlight breaking through clouds, bright eyes, delicate features, and a voice that could melt the coldest heart. But Sophie had never walked a single step. A complicated condition at birth had left her confined to a wheelchair, her legs still and unresponsive no matter how much therapy or treatment they tried. Richard had spared no expense. The finest doctors. The most advanced equipment. Private rehabilitation programs. Yet nothing had worked. He built her a world where she could have anything she wished, toys from Paris, books from London, dresses sewn by the best designers, but in all his wealth, he could not give her the one thing she truly wanted, freedom. And though they loved each other, there was a quiet distance between them. He protected her fiercely, but in doing so, he wrapped her in a kind of invisible glass safe, yet separate. Most evenings, Sophie would sit by her bedroom window, watching the gardens fade into twilight. In those moments, she imagined herself running down the path, feeling the earth beneath her feet, her hair streaming behind her like ribbons in the wind. It was a dream she never spoke aloud, not to her father, not to the staff, not even to herself when she lay in bed at night. Because dreams that never come true hurt the most. And so the Beaumont estate remained a silent stage, where Sophie's life played out in the confines of wheels and careful hands. But life has a way of shifting when you least expect it. Sometimes, the person who will change everything does not arrive with fanfare or grand promises. Sometimes, they walk in quietly, a stranger at the door, carrying not what you asked for, but what you truly need. The search for Sophie's new caretaker had become almost a ritual, and an exhausting one. For months, candidates came and went. Some were impeccably dressed, their resumes overflowing with impressive qualifications. Others arrived with glowing references from prestigious families. Yet, one by one, they were turned away. Too stiff. Too impatient. Too clinical. And always, for Richard Beaumont, there was that final unspoken verdict. Not the right kind of person. The staff whispered about his standards, calling them impossible. Some said it was because no one could truly meet his expectations. Others said it was because deep down, he could not bear to hand over the smallest piece of control when it came to Sophie. Then one quiet morning she appeared. Elena. A woman in her mid-30s, dressed simply in a navy blue cardigan and a neatly pressed skirt. Her brown hair was tied back loosely, with a few strands escaping to frame her face. She carried no flashy portfolio, no gleaming credentials. Her application was almost bare. Her references were modest: a few private families, some community work with children, nothing that would make her stand out on paper. And yet, there was something about her. A steadiness in the way she entered the room. The calm, almost unshakable way she carried herself. Richard studied her from behind his desk, already prepared to send her away with polite words. But Sophie was watching from the corner. For the first time in months, she leaned forward in her chair. During the interview, Elena spoke softly, but with a kind of quiet certainty. She did not list endless achievements or promise miracle cures. Instead, she asked Sophie questions about her favorite books, about the view from her window, about what she wished she could do if there were no limits. No one had ever interviewed her before. By the time the conversation ended, Sophie's guarded smile had broken into something rare and unrestrained. Richard noticed. And though every instinct told him to hire someone with more proof, he found himself saying, "You may start on Monday." The early days were different. Elena was gentle, yes, but not indulgent. She did not rush to do every small thing for Sophie. Instead, she encouraged her to try to move her own chair forward a few inches, to reach for the glass herself, to turn the page of a book without help. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, but the staff noticed. And they did not entirely approve. To them, Sophie was fragile, something to be handled with constant care. Elena, on the other hand, treated her as if she were capable. As if there was more to her than the limits everyone had agreed upon. Sometimes in those quiet moments, Elena would stand behind Sophie's chair, watching her with an intensity that seemed out of place. The way her eyes traced the girl's posture, the way she studied each movement, it was as though she were looking for something. Something the rest of them could not see. By the end of her first week, Elena had already become the most talked about person in the Beaumont estate, and not in the flattering way. In the servants' kitchen, whispers spread over clinking teacups. "She makes Sophie pour her own juice," one maid murmured, eyes wide. "She lets her try to wheel herself to the garden in the heat," another added, shaking her head. "She's going to hurt the poor child," the cook said flatly, slamming a pot onto the stove. They were used to the old routine, everyone doing everything for Sophie, keeping her wrapped in a constant cocoon of comfort. Elena's approach felt wrong. Even dangerous. Richard noticed the change too. One afternoon he stood in the doorway, watching Elena guide Sophie through a simple exercise, asking her to shift from her wheelchair to a cushioned bench without help. Sophie's hands trembled on the armrests, her brow furrowed. "She will never walk," Richard said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like glass. "Do not give her false hope." Elena didn't flinch. "Hope is not the problem, Mr. Beaumont. It's the absence of it that does the damage." But Sophie wasn't so sure. At first, she resisted Elena's efforts. It was not laziness, it was fear. Fear of falling. Fear of looking foolish. Fear of trying only to fail in front of the one person she wanted most to impress, her father. The breaking point came one rainy morning. Elena had encouraged Sophie to try something new, shifting herself from the bed to her chair without assistance. The gap between them was small, but to Sophie, it felt like a chasm. She pushed with her arms, slid halfway, then slipped. The thud was soft but sharp enough to make her cry out. Within seconds the door flew open. Richard stood there, eyes wide, his voice low but dangerous. "What happened?" "She fell," Elena said evenly, kneeling beside Sophie. "You let her fall?" His tone was incredulous, almost accusing. "I let her try," Elena replied, helping Sophie back into her chair with practiced care. "That's it," Richard snapped, stepping forward. "This ends now. I will not watch her be humiliated or hurt because you want to play hero." Elena straightened slowly, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "If you want her to stay in that chair forever," she said quietly, "I will leave right now. But if you want her to truly live, trust me." The room seemed to shrink around them. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists before he exhaled sharply and stepped back. "Fine," he muttered. "But if she's hurt again, you're gone." Elena said nothing more. She simply turned back to Sophie, brushing the girl's hair from her face, her voice soft now. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we try again." Change did not come in grand, sweeping gestures. It came in the smallest of victories. Elena knew better than to lecture Sophie about strength or perseverance. Instead, she disguised the work as play. On sunny afternoons, she would set a tray of colorful foam balls on the patio table, challenging Sophie to toss them into a basket at different distances. "Aim for the blue one just a little farther," Elena would say, watching Sophie stretch her arms and engage her core without realizing she was exercising. On rainy days, they built towers of wooden blocks on the floor, Sophie leaning forward to place each one. Each stretch, each reach, meant her back and abdominal muscles worked harder. Elena kept track quietly, noting the extra seconds Sophie could sit without leaning against the chair. One afternoon, Sophie sat unsupported for almost a full minute. Elena said nothing at first, just smiled and nodded, letting Sophie notice it for herself. The girl's eyes widened. I didn't fall." "No," Elena said softly, "you didn't." These moments spilled into the evenings, when the rest of the household had gone quiet. Sophie, unable to sleep, would find Elena reading in the corner of her room. It was in these late-night hours that Sophie began to open up. "I hate when people look at me like I'm broken," she confessed one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena closed her book and moved closer. "You're not broken, Sophie. You've been carrying a heavier load than most." "That's different." Sophie hesitated. "Sometimes I dream that I'm running. I can feel the grass under my feet, the wind in my hair. And then I wake up and," her voice caught. Elena placed a hand gently over hers. "Hold on to that dream. We're not done yet." While these quiet transformations unfolded in Sophie's heart, Richard remained skeptical. He saw the games in the garden, the odd exercises in the living room, and dismissed them as child's play. But every so often something caught his eye. Like the way Sophie now sat a little taller in her chair. or how she seemed less fatigued after moving herself across the room. He said nothing, but the changes did not escape him. One evening, standing at the top of the stairs, he overheard laughter from Sophie's room, light, unguarded and free. It was a sound he had not heard in years. And though he would never admit it aloud, a small part of him wondered if perhaps Elena saw something he did not. But for now he kept his distance. And Elena kept building one playful challenge, one quiet conversation, one moment of courage at a time. It happened on an evening thick with tension. Richard had returned home early from a business meeting, stepping into the library to find Elena guiding Sophie through another exercise, one that required her to balance on the edge of the bed while moving her legs slightly with her hands. "Enough," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the air. "This is going too far." Sophie's shoulders slumped. Elena turned to face him. "She's making progress," she said, her tone even. "Progress?" Richard scoffed. "She will never walk. And pushing her like this, it's cruel. Do you understand that?" For a moment, silence. Then Elena set her hands on the bed frame and spoke not with heat, but with weight. "I do understand," she said. "Better than you think." Richard frowned, ready to fire back, but her eyes held him still. "Years ago," she began slowly, "I was in a car accident. A bad one. I woke up in a hospital bed, told I might never move my legs again. I was 21 and I believed them. I spent weeks refusing therapy, convinced my life was over." She glanced briefly at Sophie, who was listening intently. "And then, a nurse came in one morning and refused to accept that I was finished. She sat with me hour after hour, making me try, making me cry, making me angry. But she never stopped. And slowly my body began to respond. It took 2 years before I could walk unassisted." Richard's expression shifted, not softened, but altered. "I worked in a pediatric rehab center after that," Elena continued, "because I knew what it was like to be told you'll never be more than what you are right now. I knew what it meant to have someone fight for you when you couldn't fight for yourself." Her voice lowered, almost a whisper. "I will not let Sophie's story end without a fight. Not while I'm here." Richard stood there, silent, something unreadable in his eyes. Pride kept him from speaking the words that hovered just behind his lips. But when he left the room, he did not tell her to stop. And for Elena, that was enough. The package arrived on a gray Thursday morning, long and narrow, carried in by 2 delivery men. The staff whispered curiously, but Elena said nothing as she signed for it and had it taken to Sophie's room. When Sophie returned from her morning reading lesson, she stopped in the doorway. There was a gleaming, custom-made lightweight support frame. Its polished metal shone under the soft lamplight, the padded handles wrapped in smooth leather. It was nothing like the cold, medical-looking walkers she'd seen before. This was hers. "What is it?" Sophie asked, her voice a mix of awe and caution. "It's a bridge," Elena said gently. "A bridge between where you are now and where you want to be." That afternoon they began. Elena helped Sophie into position, guiding her hands to the grips. Sophie's heart pounded as she felt the unfamiliar sensation of her feet pressing into the carpet. "Just breathe," Elena whispered. "We're not running a marathon. Just stand with me." Sophie pushed down on the handles, feeling her weight shift and then the fire in her legs. Her muscles, unused for so long, trembled violently. Her breath quickened, panic rising. "It hurts," she gasped. "I know," Elena murmured, steadying her. A moment later, Sophie's legs buckled. She collapsed back into her chair, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't. It's too hard. I'm not like you." Elena crouched down until she was eye level. "Do you know what happened the first time I tried to stand after my accident?" Sophie shook her head, wiping her cheeks. "I fell. Not once, not twice, over and over. And every time I told myself I was done. That it wasn't worth it. But that nurse, she looked me in the eye and said, 'If you stop now, you'll never know what could have been.'" Elena's voice softened. "Sophie, you're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to cry. But you are not allowed to decide the ending before you've given it a chance to begin." For a long moment, Sophie stared at her hands. Then, with a shaky breath, she said, "Okay, but no one can know. Not yet. Especially not my father." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because," Sophie hesitated, her voice almost breaking. "If I fail in front of him, I don't think I could try again." Elena nodded slowly. "Then it will be our secret." That night, as the rest of the house slept, Sophie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her legs still aching, her mind restless. Somewhere deep inside, a small spark had been lit. And Elena knew the real fight had just begun. The Beaumont mansion glittered under 1,000 points of light. Chandeliers blazed in the grand ballroom, casting golden reflections on the polished marble floor. The annual charity gala was in full swing, the kind of event where every guest wore diamonds, and every conversation was carefully measured. At the center of it all was Richard Beaumont, moving from group to group, shaking hands, making polite promises. Tonight was about reputation, influence, and the carefully curated image of a family that had everything. Sophie was meant to make a brief appearance, as she did every year. Elena wheeled her to the edge of the ballroom, where photographers could capture the smiling father and daughter before she would retreat again into the quiet safety of her room. But this year something was different. As they paused in the hallway just outside the main doors, Elena leaned down. "You do not have to do this," she said softly. "But if you are ready, the world is right there." Sophie's hands gripped the armrests. She could hear the hum of voices inside, the faint strains of the orchestra. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Bring it," she whispered. From behind a draped curtain, Elena pulled out the support frame polished to a shine, waiting like an unspoken promise. The hallway was empty except for them. Elena steadied the frame as Sophie placed her hands on it. "Remember," Elena murmured, "one breath at a time." Sophie pushed herself up. Her legs trembled violently under her weight, every muscle screaming in protest. But she stood. Step. The first was hesitant, her foot barely clearing the ground. Step. The second was stronger, the frame bearing most of her weight but her body moving forward on its own will. As they reached the edge of the ballroom, Elena whispered, "Whenever you're ready." Sophie let go. For 2 heart-stopping seconds, she stood unsupported, and then, with the music fading and every eye turning toward her, she took a step into the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The orchestra faltered. And then, silence. Richard froze mid-conversation. His glass slipped slightly in his hand as he watched his daughter, his Sophie, walking toward him. Her legs shook, her steps uneven, but her chin was high, her eyes locked on his. When she reached him, the room erupted, applause thundering against the marble walls. But Richard heard none of it. He was already kneeling, his hands on her trembling shoulders, tears welling in his eyes. You walked," he whispered. Sophie smiled through her own tears. "I told you I just needed time." And in that moment, the gala, the guests, the business deals, all of it faded. There was only a father, a daughter, and the miracle he thought he'd never see. The applause from the gala still echoed faintly in Richard's ears long after the last guest had gone. The ballroom, now empty, felt different, lighter somehow, as though the house itself had witnessed something sacred. Richard sat beside Sophie in the library, the fire casting a warm glow over the room. He watched her hands rest on her lap, still trembling slightly from the effort of the evening, yet steady in their own way. She was tired, he could see it in her eyes, but there was also something else there. A spark. He reached out, taking her small hand in his. "You have no idea how proud I am of you," he said quietly. His voice caught, and he looked away for a moment before continuing. "You showed me something tonight I thought I'd never see. And I was wrong about what was possible and about the person who made it possible." Later, he found Elena in the kitchen, clearing away the last of the evening's dishes. She looked up at him, unsure of what to expect. "Thank you," Richard said simply. The words felt strange in his mouth. Humility was not something he often allowed himself. "You gave my daughter a life I thought was beyond her reach. I doubted you. I fought you. And I owe you more than I can ever repay." Elena's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Beaumont. You just have to keep believing in her even on the days it's hard." In the days that followed, the staff's whispers changed. The same people who had once criticized Elena now stopped her in the hallway, offering awkward but sincere apologies. "I was wrong about you," the head housekeeper admitted one afternoon, her cheeks flushed. Elena simply nodded. "We were all wrong about what Sophie could do. And Sophie, she was different now." Each morning she insisted on practicing. Sometimes in the garden, sometimes down the hallway toward her father's study. The steps were still unsteady, her legs still wobbled, but the determination in her eyes never wavered. She laughed more, spoke more, dreamed out loud instead of keeping it all locked inside. Richard began joining her for those short walks, always keeping a respectful distance, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to let her try. The man who once believed safety meant holding her back now understood that real protection meant letting her stand even if she might stumble. And every time Sophie took a step, it wasn't just her body that grew stronger. It was the bond between them, finally free of the invisible glass that had kept them apart for so long. Sometimes the greatest wealth is not in what we keep safe but in what we set free. The weeks after the gala passed in a quiet but powerful transformation. The Beaumont estate was still grand, still immaculate, but now its marble halls carried a different kind of sound, the steady rhythm of Sophie's footsteps. They were small steps, sometimes halting, sometimes unsure, but each one was a declaration. Elena no longer came to work as the nanny. That title had been replaced with something far more important: Sophie's official mobility coach. The role meant more than guiding her through exercises, it meant guiding her toward independence, toward a life not defined by what she could not do, but by everything she could. Richard approved the change without hesitation. In fact, he insisted on it. "You're not just part of this household anymore, Elena," he said one afternoon, standing in the sunlit garden. "You're part of this family." She simply smiled, knowing that for all his formality, the words came from the deepest place in his heart. And Sophie was living the dream she had once only dared to whisper about. She walked to the breakfast table each morning, wheeled herself only when she chose to, and no longer avoided mirrors. She had begun to see herself the way Elena had always seen her: capable, strong, unstoppable. One evening Richard asked her to join him in the ballroom. The chandeliers were lit, just as they had been on the night everything changed, their golden light spilling across the floor. He extended a hand. Sophie hesitated for just a moment, then placed her hand in his. Together they stepped to the center of the room. The music began soft, slow, deliberate. Her steps were careful at first, her eyes fixed on his for reassurance. But soon they found a rhythm. Father and daughter, moving together beneath the same chandelier where the world had once gasped in disbelief. Only now there were no gasps. Only laughter, bright, unrestrained, and echoing through the grand hall like a promise kept. From the doorway Elena watched. She didn't need to be in the center of the moment to feel its weight. This was what she had fought for. Not applause. Not recognition. But this: a life in motion. The narrator's voice lingers in the air. Wealth is not measured by the treasures we protect, but by the lives we help set free. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give is not to shield someone from the world, but to hand them the courage to stand in it. And under that chandelier Sophie stood. Not as the girl in the chair, but as the girl who could dance,